Thanks for sharing that beautiful native garden with us. Very appropriate for Native Plant Week, which is happening October 14th through 20th. And of course, that means all sorts of activities at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, including their big plant sale, which is happening on the 13th and 14th. You can learn more about that at wildflower.org. We're going to continue with our native theme right now. I'm joined by Mitchamore with Hill Country Natives, and it's a pleasure to have you on, Central Texas Gardener.
Thank you.
We're going to be talking about a concept that's very exciting to me, which is forest gardens and native trees. And before we dive in and start talking about the particulars of the plants and the concept here, I want to give people an idea about how you got involved in the plant business, because I understand this is actually kind of a new career for you in a way.
It is, and I came to it like a lot of people are experiencing these days, involuntarily.
Okay.
My career disappeared one morning, and so I spent some time trying to figure out what I could do to stay out of a cubicle the rest of my life.
Good for you.
And it took a few years, but I began this growing trees as a hobby. And the more I learned, particularly from the Wildflower Center, the more interested I became and the more involved I became. Even my wife became involved, which was a miracle in itself. She still has a job. But the business morphed about 5 years, I guess I'd say, before we decided to call it a commercial endeavor. And it's grown from that one group of 48 live oaks to better than 80 species and more than 8,000 trees at this point.
Wow, that's impressive. Now, I understand that you are a retail center. You do open to the public, but on a limited basis on Fridays and Saturdays, correct?
Well, all of the above, really. If a potential customer has a need, I can be flexible enough to meet that need. We have some people who are doing their do-it-yourself landscaping and may have a sizable project. So we might visit with them, sit in a gazebo and drink some tea or something and talk about what they want to do, and tour our gardens. And in many cases, we have trees growing there that they've never seen except in pictures.
Sure.
So that's useful, and we can be flexible in that regard. But as far as someone just showing up to buy plants like they would at a regular retail nursery, I'm a one-man show, so I can't always be there.
Okay, well, that's understood. And people are be well advised to give you a shout in advance before heading out.
We try to be there Friday and Saturday for the do-it-yourselfer.
Okay, very good. Well, the concept that I want to talk about that you're forwarding here is really a beautiful one and makes a lot of sense as a technique for building a sustainable kind of ecosystem in your yard or garden. That's right. And that's a forest garden. And it really involves kind of a layering of trees and woody species to provide kind of a sustainable system. And it all starts with a canopy, right?
That's right. And the idea was really reinforced by the summers of 2010 and 2011, hottest and driest we've experienced. When almost nothing would grow, I started thinking more and more about growing stuff in the shade. We are fortunate to have a little bit of a native canopy. And
so live oaks and cedar elms,
live
things
oaks,
like that.
Cedar elms, and even some junipers, some
Right.
mature junipers. They get on up to 30 to 50 feet in height. And so in that shade, things were doing better than in full sun. So I kind of took it to heart and started preaching that as a gospel, that if people could provide part shade for whatever it is they wanted to do, it would be more pleasant and more successful. After all, nearly everyone still has a job. We don't want to make gardening into a difficult thing. We want it to be pleasant and productive.
And hopefully a little bit refreshing, and a shade garden will provide that little breath of cool.
It's even nice if you got a couple of trees you can hang a hammock from.
Hey, that's not a bad idea. Now, in addition to the trees we've already mentioned as canopy trees, the live oaks, cedar elms, the cedars themselves, I want to throw a couple of other trees in the mix. I'm always touting the lacy oak, which is a great hill country survivor. smallish tree, but a super dependable one.
It is.
And then there's the honey locust, is a tree that you're advocating. Tell us a little bit about the honey locust.
Well, I was looking at it quite favorably as a light dappled shade, deep-rooted tree that you could potentially grow other things under it. And we recently saw that that's the dominant landscaping tree in southwest Colorado. So this is an area of less than 10 inches of rain a year, and I took that to be a strong advocate for drought-tolerant tree.
Yeah. Well, they're a widely used tree in many parts of the country, but not as often here. So I was just a little bit intrigued to learn a little bit more about that. Now, you've brought with you some small 1-gallon size plants from your garden, and some of these are canopy-sized trees when they grow. And I want to start by this one that I have right next to me on my right hand here, and this is, I love Texas ash. I mean, I hate the Arizona ash, love the Texas ash. And one of the reasons I really like about this plant, or things I like about it, is great fall color.
Yes.
It can be one of the best fall color plants we've got. What are some of the other attributes of this little tree?
Well, to me, probably the primary is that it's different, a different variety. We want to get away from a straight oak cedar realm and include some ash, maples, and the soapberry that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And so playing off that, I actually went looking for an ash that was native and could play a role in that context, and I've had good success with the Texas ash.
It's native throughout the hill country. It grows on the plateaus as well as in the canyons. And typically it gets to, what, it'd be about 25 or 30 feet tall?
Typically, I call the canopy layer 30 to 50 feet, but in the hill country where we're focused, it's typically more around 30 feet, 30 to 40 maybe.
Well, it's a super plant, and evident from its native range, it is obviously a drought-tolerant plant. Now, you mentioned the maple, and again, one of my all-time favorite plants in the whole world, big-tooth maple, of Lost Maples fame. And this is a plant that is still, I would say it's sought after now, but it's still not common in the trade.
Fairly difficult to grow to any size in a reasonable length of time. If you're establishing a new landscape, you want something to move right along, and the big-tooth maple typically doesn't do that. Its first few years, it tends to grow very slowly in the shade of its parents or in the shade of a canyon down, like down in the river region. And so it might be several years before it gets to be 3 or 4 feet in height. If it's established at that time, it'll pick up speed and do 2 or 3 feet a year. Well, and good fall color again.
Oh yeah, spectacular color, dependable from one year to the next in terms of its color. And I found that with extensive soil preparation and in the garden that I've had, these things actually will grow quickly.
Yes, they will.
But if again, the soil's prepared in a wide area around where the planting is
they do
place.
have a shallow root system compared to some of these other native trees.
You also mentioned the soapberry, which is a plant we haven't talked about on this program in, gosh, I bet it's been at least 10 years. And this is a tough as nails little plant.
Absolutely. You find it growing along 29 out by Llano. If something can grow well out there, it can grow anywhere.
And again, can get to scale. I mean, 25 or 30 feet tall. Kind of that narrow pecan-like leaf on a mature plant.
And a dappled shade, so you can do things under it if you wish.
So, and I like that emphasis that you're placing on the dappled shade, because you know, a lot of us want to use things that are very xeric, which require some sun. And going with an approach of some dappled shade kind of overstory or canopy kind of plants really can make all the difference in the world.
Absolutely.
And now some of the smaller plants to go underneath of that, you've brought some of those along as well. And I want to kind of focus on some of those. Now, one that you've brought that's immediately at hand is the kidney wood. And this is one of those little plants that's like in the mimosa family, I believe, or something like that. It obviously has that very delicate mimosa-like kind of texture to it. And the hill country is replete with these kinds of plants, these little feathery plants that seem to go and go.
But real often, folks have not seen how attractive this tree can be because they've only seen it in pastures where the cattle and deer have access to it.
Right.
It's a favorite deer food.
Mm-hmm.
And so a tree like that can get a little beat up looking.
Mm-hmm.
But if protected in a yard or landscape, it can grow into a nice shaped tree. Right now they're blooming, and it's a good fragrance.
Yeah, well, and they're very fragrant. It's a delicious fragrance. In fact, when they bloom in mass, and you drive down one of those little hill country roads and they're in bloom, I mean, it perfumes an entire river valley.
That's right.
And a really wonderful little plant. Another thing that you advocate, and I want to talk about, is the use of native fruit trees as understory. And people are increasingly interested in any kind of food production whatsoever, including just like the little native plums. And we're well familiar with like Mexican plum, but you're also advocating for things like the Chickasaw plum, which is something that, again, a plant that I've heard of, but I don't know much about.
It's a smaller tree. It may tend to form a thicket, and so it may not be really good for a formal setting. But if you have a corner where you're trying to establish a more naturalistic look, a Chickasaw plum can fit in real well, and it can produce an edible fruit.
Yeah. Blanco crabapple is another plant that actually occasionally you will see on the market. Love this plant. Beautiful flower. Interesting foliage as well.
It is. Again, it might form a thicket. You have to be a little leery of it creeping into a St. Augustine lawn, but I'm finding that's falling out of favor pretty rapidly. So
yeah. Well, it's a well-behaved, slow-growing plant, too.
Yes, it is.
Beware the thorns.
Yes, very true. Most beautiful flowering tree I've ever seen.
It is a magnificent bloom and stunning when you first see it. You can't believe that this plant isn't used everywhere.
Yes.
Absolutely beautiful.
Hard to find.
Hard to find. That's the reason why. And that's why we're thankful for you, Mitch, and the work that you're doing at Hill Country Natives. And real quickly, tell people how they can be in touch. Are you online?
Yes, we have a website. It's hillcountrynatives.net.
Okay.
And I do most of it by email.
All right.
Most communication.
Okay, well, this has been a lot of fun and appropriate conversation for Native Plant Week, and people can learn more about the activities of the Wildflower Center at wildflower.org. Mitch, we thank you very much for being here.
I appreciate it.
Okay, coming up next is our friend Daphne.